Good evening, everyone. Welcome. Hi, my name is Am Johal. I'm Director of Community Engagement with SFU's Vancity Office of Community Engagement. Wonderful to be partnering with the Tyee on the discussion this evening with Andrew Nikiforuk, Standing Up to Fracking, and of course his book is available as well, Slick Water. I wanted to begin by acknowledging that we're on the unceded territories of the Coast Salish people, the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh. Introducing Andrew is going to be Robin Smith. She's the editor-in-chief of the Tyee. She previously served as the Tyee's BC 23 elections editor, has worked for the Tyee since 2011. She's a graduate of UBC's School of Journalism. I ask you to join me in welcoming Robin.
Thanks, Sam, and good evening, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us tonight for what I know will be a very special evening with Andrew Nikiforuk. I first started working with Andrew as a new editor at the Tyee a few years ago, and at the time I knew him to be one of Canada's bravest energy journalists, and it was an honor to be assigned to work on some of his stories. Soon after we started working together, Andrew started filing these stories on small earthquakes being recorded in places like northern Alberta and northern BC. And the cause, he reported, was fracking operations. It was troubling stuff, but certainly troubling to somebody totally new to the issue. And more troubling was that the stakes seemed to increase with every story Andrew filed. I found myself searching the web to see if anyone else was reporting these kinds of stories, and I couldn't find much. I found myself writing headlines like, "Fracking industry shakes up northern BC with 231 tremors," and "Did Alberta just break a fracking earthquake world record?" Headlines that if they weren't thoroughly and expertly reported by Canada's best energy journalist, I might have filed away in this computer folder I have called sketchy stuff, which is mostly just Sasquatch sightings that we get at the Tyee. But of course, now I know Andrew was right. Alberta did break a fracking earthquake world record and has again since. And now I think I know why Andrew was the first to have the story, because few media outlets these days seem to feel it necessary to so closely police Canada's powerful energy companies and regulators and those who profit from industry. And Andrew has never shied away from difficult stories that make powerful people queasy. On his website, he cites this G.K. Chesterton quote that I think fits him perfectly. It reads, "I believe in getting into hot water. It keeps you clean." Tonight you're in the hands of an expert. Andrew's career writing about energy, economics, and the West has spanned more than 2 decades. He's won 7 national magazine awards and top honors for investigative writing from the Association of Canadian Journalists. He's the author of half a dozen books, including The Tar Sands, Dirty Oil, and The Future of the Continent, which was a national bestseller and winner of the prestigious Rachel Carson Environment Book Award. Andrew's latest book, Slick Water, Fracking in One Insider's Stand Against the World's Most Powerful Industry, is of course the one we're here to celebrate tonight. It's the result of more than a decade reporting the story of Jessica Ernst, whose battle over fracking regulation, water contamination, and charter rights just recently reached the Supreme Court of Canada. Tonight, Andrew will start by giving a 45-minute presentation, and after that, we're lucky to have Tyee founding editor David Beers, who first brought Andrew onto the Tyee in 2010 and was his editor for many years, to join Andrew on stage for a conversation. Dave will then field a few questions from the audience, and he'll explain how that will work when the time comes. After that wraps up, we'll move to the reception area down the hall, and that's where you can buy a book if you haven't yet, buy a drink, shake Andrew's hand, and get your book signed. Before we begin, I'd just like to say a quick thanks to SFU's Vancity Office of Community Engagement, who is co-presenting this event with us tonight. And thanks also to Greystone Books, Andrew's publisher, and our supporting partner for the evening. And finally, I have to thank Tyee builders. Are there any Tyee builders in the house? You can cheer, you can whoop, you can. All right, there we go. You are wise people, the wise people who support Tyee journalists like Andrew. Your voluntary contributions each month allow us to do journalism that's accountable to no one but readers. If you're not yet a Tyee builder, please consider joining. There is a table outside by the reception, or you can find me after. I'd be more than happy to explain the program to you. Again, thank you so much for joining us tonight. And now, please help me welcome to the stage Andrew Nikiforuk.
Thank you very much, Robin, for that very generous introduction. In particular, I want to thank Robin and Jeanette for helping to organize this event tonight, as well as the good folks at Greystone, Zoe and Andrea, who've put in a fair amount of time. And I also want to thank you for coming out and actually supporting the Tyee and making what we do so real. My talk, when I was thinking about this, talking about LNG and shale gas and earthquakes, and this remarkable woman, Jessica Ernst, who's caused a bit of a political earthquake in Alberta, it struck me as déjà vu. And 10 years ago, in Alberta, I was talking about a different resource. And the resource was, of course, bitumen. And I was dealing with a government that said bitumen is the best thing since sliced bread. It's going to make us rich. We're going to build upgraders. We're going to build pipelines. And to get this all going, we're going to lower the royalties down to 1% or next to nothing. We're practically almost going to give it away, but this is good business for all of us. And I remember thinking at the time that this was absolutely crazy. And that this was to stake the entire province's future on the overproduction of one resource that is well known as one of the most volatile commodities on the planet was foolhardy. And I said, wait a minute, guys. You need to slow down. You need to save the money. You need to collect your fair share for future generations. You need to behave like an owner, and you need to clean up the environmental mess that you're making in Fort Mac. And of course, I can't tell you all of the names that I was called for suggesting. How ridiculous is that to suggest to a government maybe you should sit down and slow down and actually think about what you're doing. And here we are in BC. Reliving the same Canadian folly right down to lowering the taxes, lowering the royalties, a government that has become a total and complete cheerleader for a resource that the rest of the world at the moment is saying, hey, we're dealing with overproduction of natural gas all across the globe, and we're going to see low prices probably for the next decade. This is not a good venture for the people of British Columbia to get involved in on the scale that the government is proposing. So I want to talk a bit about that tonight. I also want to talk about this amazing phenomenon that you cannot have LNG without this technology, brute force technology called fracking, which is making earthquakes. Now, most of you all had the experience of feeling a 4.6 earthquake a couple of weeks ago, all right? But do you guys remember that? Did the walls sort of move for you and a few other things? My wife, Doreen, was actually staying in Vancouver at the time, and she could see the walls coming in on her. Well, we have a company called Progress Energy, which is actually owned by Petronas, which has caused similar scale earthquakes in northern British Columbia. The last major earthquake they caused was a 4.6, and that was just last year. They've also caused a 4.4. Once you hit a magnitude of 5, you're assured a property of damage of one kind or another. Roads that buckle, pipelines that burst, buildings that fall down. Where are we in Alberta? Well, we're always a little bit ahead of the pack here in Alberta. We're making bigger earthquakes. 4.8. This is a Spanish company in Fox Creek, again fracking, creating a 4.8 earthquake. So, and this whole story is an interesting one, and I want to get into it a bit because the industry has said repeatedly, don't worry, this technology is safe and proven. And, everything is cool and okay. And then we have this gal, this remarkable woman, Jessica Ernst, who is challenging this industry by essentially saying, look, there's no way you can effectively regulate a technology as unpredictable and as risky and as destructive as hydraulic fracturing. And she has a hell of a tale to tell about how this technology in central Alberta, when it was used indiscriminately in a shallow coal field, resulted in the contamination, not just of her groundwater, but of the groundwater of scores of people. But let's begin with this larger tale that you are now living here in British Columbia in terms of LNG. Government is saying, hey, guys, this is the future. We have 20 different proposals, but by the way, nobody has said they're going to construct anything yet, right? Because they're all hedging their bets. They all know this is kind of iffy. But your government is telling you this is yes country. We will bring all of these projects to yes, because in British Columbia we are positive thinkers, and we believe in the power of yes, especially when we have lowered the royalties, when we have lowered the taxes, provide these companies free water, free geoscience, and have provided them with more than $1 billion worth of subsidies in terms of pipeline and road construction incentives. And what is driving all of this? One technology. And this is all about cracking rock. And it's taking fluids, in most cases water, but the fluid could also be CO2. It could be nitrogen. In the frack fields of central Alberta, companies are using exclusively diesel fuel and distillate to frack rock underground. So they're taking some of the world's most toxic hydrocarbons, and 100% of their frack fluid is diesel fuel. So one thing you need to know right away about shale, it's one of the world's most common rocks. You'll notice in this illustration here how naturally fractured it already is. And then we come along and take a whole bunch of fluid under very high pressure, much like a fire hose, but much more pressure than that, and we're shooting it down a well bore 1 to 2 kilometers, in some cases only 400 meters, and we're shattering this rock and we're creating more fractures over acres and acres and acres of land to release molecules of gas or oil. What we are doing here is really a form of desperation. We are chasing diminishing returns. Years ago, we would go after the low-hanging fruit and gas pools and oil pools where we'd stick down a straw and we'd suck this stuff up, and there would be lots of it. It would last a couple of years. Very, very lucrative, high-producing wells. High quality. It was called conventional. That stuff is gone now. And so we've had to move down the resource pyramid. And at the bottom of this pyramid is some of the worst stuff ever, and that's shale oil and shale gas. And it is immensely crappy rock. And you can only make this venture economic by fracturing areas the size of France or West Virginia. I mean, you need a huge amount of real estate, and you need tens of thousands of wells and millions of fracture treatments to release this stuff. And we are calling this business as usual. And that's where the big lie is. This is not business as usual. This is extreme business. And not only that, it is chasing diminishing returns. So here's one of the, I think, one of the top analysts in North America when it comes to oil and gas issues, Arthur Berman. He lives in Houston. He owns oil and gas wells. And here's the reality. He said, oil companies have to make a big deal about shale plays because that is all that is left in the world. Let's face it, there are truly awful reservoir rocks, and that is why we waited until all more attractive opportunities were exhausted before developing them. It is completely unreasonable to expect better performance from bad reservoirs than from better reservoirs. And yet, that's where the industry is at. 90% of almost all oil and gas wells in North America today are being fracked because they are that poor quality. Now, LNG. What do you need to know about it? Basically, you need to know that this is not a job-making industry. This is one of the world's most capital-intensive industry. In fact, all the oil and gas industry isn't about making jobs. It's about making a very few high-paying jobs and spending tens of billions of dollars on a very high-cost, very complex processes to move around these unconventional hydrocarbons. So LNG's been around for a while, about 40, 50 years. It was really the Japanese that pioneered it, of course, a nation with virtually no hydrocarbons. And the complexity really comes down to the fact that you're taking gas and you're cooling it at 162 degrees and shrinking it thereby and compressing it and putting it in a tanker, and then you're moving it around. And in the process, the energy to do all that is consuming about 20% of the product in the process. Here's what I think is really important to understand about natural gas here. Due to its lower energy intensity, it costs between 7 and 10 times more to transport than oil or coal. The cost of transportation is a much higher share of the cost of delivered product, which is why most gas is consumed within its region of origin. And that's the International Energy Agency based in Paris, talking about LNG and natural gas exports. All right, so this industry has boomed in recent years, and Christy Clark and her government have embraced it, and they have embraced it with the same zeal that Tories in Alberta embraced bitumen. I remember one of the energy ministers back in 2002, 2003, declaring to the world that bitumen was the jewel of hydrocarbons. I kid you not. You know, and this stuff that is, you know, stuck in sand so abrasive that it wears down machinery to nothing in the space of 6 months, and that requires massive upgrading, that's got too much sulfur and not enough other stuff in it that it needs to be upgraded. It hasn't got enough hydrogen in it, and so you're playing with this massively, and then at the end of the day, you're getting something called synthetic fuel, and it's got this low price associated with it. So now the government in BC is saying, look, shale gas is just this extraordinary resource, and we've got to do something about it. And lo and behold, I found these slides about 8 years ago that the government was using to tell other governments in Alaska and elsewhere how it was going to approach the extraction of this resource. All right, so we don't want the feds involved. We don't want any prescriptive regulations, you know, with interest groups, provincial agencies. Forget all of that. You'll strangle the golden goose. And that's how they were talking about shale gas. It's the golden goose. And then they said, well, how are we going to make this all happen? Well, we'll lower royalties. We'll reduce regulations. We'll improve road access, high-quality geoscience information, and on it goes. It almost like the government is saying, we're going to take a Soviet approach to this. We're really going to give you a hand up. You don't have to spend anything. We'll spend it for you, and we'll call this free enterprise. And meanwhile, the prices have gone south on this dream of exporting this resource to Asia, and particularly Chinese markets. The dream started, well, look, with 15 a million BTU is $15 a million BTU. That's great. And 2008, 2009, the prices for LNG were actually, that extraordinary. Even made it up to $21 at one point. The reality today is that due to overproduction of the resource in places like Australia and elsewhere, and due to the tanking of the Chinese economy, which is a substantial event, and due to the overproduction of shale gas all over the place, prices have really come down. And it costs a lot to frack shale in northern BC, and then to pipe it, and then to cool it, and then to transport it to Asia. And the economics are not there. So you have really key groups in industry saying, look, global LNG markets are likely to be oversupplied for the next several years, and the low LNG prices now observed seem likely to persist for some time. This is a reality that has not yet hit the cheerleading LNG section of the provincial government. They're saying, yes, we can still do this, yes. And they are oblivious to these developments, right? So the great part, that's all the LNG in the world that's already being produced. It's a formidable amount, most of it coming from the Middle East and Africa. And then we have all this new production coming on stream, almost all of it from Australia, a bit from Russia, and also from Papua New Guinea. And so you're almost doubling production. This is without any LNG terminals in BC. And what about the scale of what the government has proposed? So they're saying, okay, well, there's 20 applications out there, right? And the National Energy Board has improved them all incredibly. But if we just get 5 of these to go, that's 4 trillion cubic feet of gas. And that's really the equivalent of 2 million barrels of oil per day. They're saying, look, we can do exactly what Alberta has done, which Alberta is suffering mightily from at this point in time. And in order to do this, in order to fill 4 or 5 LNG terminals, you've got to, in Alberta, in BC right now, you have around 8,000 to 9,000 horizontal wells that are being fracked. You have in total about 27,000 wells that have been drilled in northern BC over the last 40, 50 years. So just to fill these terminals alone, you are going to have to, over the next 25 years, drill another 50,000 wells. All of them will require frack jobs. That's nearly 3,000 wells per year. Some industry estimates are even higher than that. They're saying in the Montney Shale alone, we might need 130,000 wells, and that's 15 frack jobs per well. That's 2 million possible fracks over the total life of shale gas development alone in the Montney. And, fracks are fluid injection into the ground that can cause earthquakes. So that's earthquake potential is on an upward swing here in this province. So here's just a very basic, simple illustration of what the fracking looks like with horizontal well bores, where you're taking that fluid and injecting it down and spreading it out over a huge acreage where you're trying to crack as much possible rock as you can. And you're thinking, well, what could be possibly wrong with this form of crude mining underground? Well, one of the problems concerns the fact that we already have 5 million oil and gas wells in the ground throughout North America. And all of these wells, to one degree or another, are leaking methane at this point in time. Some of this methane is going into the atmosphere, some of it's coming up just around the wellhead, some of it's coming up into groundwater, some of it's even leaking up into other oil and gas infrastructure. This is a slide from a very well-known gas migration expert in Alberta, Carlos Mullenbachs, just documenting some of the very serious locations of methane leakage, what the industry calls surface casing venting, throughout Alberta and British Columbia. And you're thinking, okay, so what's the problem? I mean, why are all these wells leaking? What's going on here? Well, it's a bubblegum issue, really. All of these wells are sealed with cement. And the problem with cement is that as it grows old, it corrodes and degrades, and over time begins to look like a dried up piece of bubblegum underneath the very seat you might be sitting on. And as that happens, these wells begin to leak more and more. So you have this existing liability in the industry that is not terribly well quantified, but it is increasingly on the radar, everyone's radar. You have some of the top petroleum engineers in the country saying, whoa, we've got 500,000 wells in Western Canada alone. They are a threat to environment and public safety. Methane, by the way, is an explosive thing. And here we are, we're doing all this fracking and also steam injection. And what does that do? Well, that elevates the mechanical and thermal loading on well bores and significantly increases the probability of leakage. So it'd be like living next to a house that was actively injecting stuff into the ground, causing miniature earthquakes all the time, so much so that the plumbing in your house was rattling to such an extraordinary degree that you started to get leaks in the tub and leaks in the sink and leaks in the basement all over the place. And that is the liability the oil and gas industry is facing with fracking. And here's one of my favorite slides, again, an industry slide saying, oh my God, the skeletons are coming out of the closet. All right, so what about this fracking business, which industry portrays so quaintly, like here, this is all about a friendly frackosaurus. He's coming to your neighborhood. You're not going to notice what the hell's going on here. And he's, and he's going after clean energy, something really clean. And what could be possibly wrong with this? That's not the story. That's not how fracking started at all. In fact, fracking has a very litigious, bloody, violent history going right back to the Civil War. And if you really want to understand why things end badly, you sometimes have to understand how they actually began. So the world's first oil fields were in Pennsylvania. Actually, in North America, there were fields in Russia being exploited at the same time. And you had this extraordinary density of wells, and they'd be drilling down shallowly, about 50 meters, 100 meters. And then these wells would be producing 5, 10, 15 barrels a day, and then they would, go dry. And then the owners of these wells would panic and say, we've got to do something to get these wells producing oil again. What do we do? And so along comes this guy by the name of Colonel Roberts, a cashiered colonel from the Union Army who survived the Battle of Fredericksburg, largely because he was drunk at the time, and who comes up with the idea, well, why don't we take a torpedo, fill it with black powder, and chuck it down these well bores and blow the hell out of the bottom of the well, and there'll be some water down there. The water will tamper the fractures, and maybe we'll be able to increase production. Sure enough, it works like a charm, not all the time, but it actually worked in Pennsylvania at the time. And Roberts had his torpedo patented, and anyone that tried to use a different method or a different explosive, he would sue the pants off. And so fracking started in the United States as the most litigious industry ever seen in the United States. And he hired Pinkertons to go out in the country to prevent other well owners from hiring independent torpedo men, as they would be sometimes called, who very quickly they moved to nitroglycerin as their explosive stock. And so the guys would be going out in the bush in the middle of the night with cans of nitroglycerin strapped to their backs to go frack these failing wells and bring them back into life. And in the process, a lot of them blew themselves to kingdom come. And the newspapers in Pennsylvania at the time, I mean, it's quite gruesome, but they gloated over what a violent enterprise torpedoing was. And they would, so-and-so went out and fracked this well, and a foot and a hand and parts of his nose were found the next day, and we put them in a cigar box. And I mean, the story after story after story about early fracking misadventures. And then the industry graduated, and from nitro they went on and they tried acids, and then by the 1940s they started to experiment with fluids, and in the 1950s they'd sort of come up with this idea. All right, well let's inject, let's take some horsepower and let's inject a fluid. We'll use 600 horsepower, and let's take 10,000 gallons of diesel or napalm, because there was a lot of napalm left over from World War II, and let's inject it down a well, and then we'll also chuck down a whole bunch of nails and acorns and walnut husks and whatever we have there to keep these fractures open, and see if we can't get these wells going again. Because industry, of course, was always facing the dilemma of depletion. And so that was what industry calls today really they consider it, this was the birth of fracking. And it was a very modest exercise. All these wells were vertical, and they would be 400 meters, 500 meters, 600 meters deep. But despite all of the money being spent, at the end of the day, when you added all what was actually being added to production, it was only a year's worth of production that hydraulic fracturing was actually able to increase. But it gained this mythical status. It was kind of like, plastic surgery, that plastic surgery will make you look young again, but it will not stop the aging process, right? And so the scale of the technology at the time was like a canoe, in simple terms. Not a lot of horsepower, not a lot of fluid, not a lot of fracking sand was being used. And they realized that, but this didn't last for long. Industry realized it had to use more and more brute force. And as a consequence of using more and more brute force, you find throughout industry publications these problems. Well, geologic discontinuities such as fractures and faults can dominate fracture geometry in a way that makes predicting hydraulic fracture behavior difficult. In plain English, we don't know where all the fracks are going. We're using a lot of force, but we don't know where they are all going. We have no model that's going to tell us where they're all going. We know they're going to follow the path of least resistance. We know that we're going into water. We know that we're connecting with other oil and gas wells sometimes. We know that we're even coming to surface. So it's kind of a science experiment. And in the 1960s, engineers also thought, well, why don't we do the mother of all fracks? Why don't we take a nuclear bomb and see if we can't shatter shale rock? I mean, they did the same thing in Fort Mac. Why don't we take a nuclear bomb and see if we can't really get the bitumen producing well? And of course, they didn't do that in Fort Mac, but in Colorado they did, and only to discover there's as yet no market for radioactive natural gas. Funny, how that works. But they did shatter a whole bunch of shale and had this kind of like glass bulb all around it, but no market for the stuff. So then they wised up and they said, well, what we really need, we need more fluid, we need it at higher pressures, and we really got to zap this rock like you wouldn't believe. So, and by 2005, 2006, the frack jobs were using 5 million gallons. And in some cases, 25,000, 40,000 horsepower. If you were to take all of the horsepower the fracking industry has at its command today to inject fluid into the ground, it would be the equivalent of commandeering 11 medium-sized nuclear reactors in the United States, and with one sole dedicated role, that of injecting fluid underground to crack rock. extraordinary. So, all right, so why then is this industry creating so many earthquakes, and what's the history here? Well, part of it has to do with the fact that in British Columbia, in Alberta, we're just fracking more fluid than anywhere else. All right, so we're injecting it at much higher pressures, and we're also injecting much more fluid into the ground. And any geologist will tell you that 1 mile to 2 miles below the surface of the Earth is where the Earth is in transition and where the most faults and fractures naturally occur, and that's exactly what we are fracking into. And we have no map that tells us where all of these natural fractures and faults are. So that's one reason why Alberta and BC have been so seismically active. Of course, the other is, fracking was a canoe operation in terms of technology. Now it's this nuclear submarine. And not only that, but it's a nuclear submarine with a very bad navigation program. So here's Baker Hughes, one of the big frackers in the United States, revealing in a 2012 presentation some of the problems with frackings. Well, 70% of unconventional wells in the U.S. do not reach their production targets. In other words, we want to frack out there somewhere, but we're not sure where the hell we're going, and we're going to miss this sweet spot altogether. 60% of all fracture stages are ineffective. So we're going to hammer this rock again and again and again with fluid injection for no purpose. I mean, for no reason, really. We're not going to get anything out of it. And then 73% of the operators say, we don't know what the hell is going on in the subterranean ground beneath us. We don't know where the faults are, where the fractures are. So here's the industry basically admitting, yeah, this is a science experiment. This is a cowboy science experiment. And wow, man, when we hit a fracture and fault, you're going to feel it, and it'll be a 4.4, 4.6, 4.8. So how long have we known this? How long have we known that fluid injection create earthquakes? Well, here's this report actually came out in the early 1990. It was cataloged as 1951, but a report came out in 1990. And so this is from the U.S. Geological Survey in the United States, arguably one of the best scientific organizations left in the United States. And here they're recording, as early in the 1970s, commercial stimulation, which is another way of saying hydraulic fracturing, of a 3,000 deep well near Wilson, Oklahoma, triggered 70 earthquakes in 6.2 hours. So they knew as early in the 1970s that mega fracturing operations, in other words, high volume, lots of slick water fracks, in other words, where water is, you're trying to make it more slick and adding a variety of chemicals and gels so it slides down the wellbore that much faster and that much harder, was causing earthquakes. But it goes back even further than that. The U.S. Army in the 1960s had a big problem at the Rocky Mountain Arsenal in Colorado, and where they'd been making biological and chemical warfare agents. And they needed to do something with all this stuff because it was polluting groundwater. And they thought, well, the solution surely is we'll inject it in the ground, and what could be wrong with that? So they started injecting, millions and millions and millions of gallons of this stuff deep into the ground. And then some curious researchers began to notice that, they were getting these earthquakes, magnitude 2, magnitude 3, and they could chart these earthquakes directly to the volume of fluid being injected into the ground. And finally some smarter minds kind of said, well, wait a moment, this could be a real problem. We could cause a major earthquake outside of Denver, which they did. In 1967, actually, after they closed the operation down, they had a wave of earthquakes continued to rattle on. This particular earthquake caused, hundreds of millions worth of damage. So they knew then that fluid injection, since the 1960s, can cause earthquakes. They knew that hydraulic fracturing, which is another form of fluid injection, can cause earthquakes. They also knew that wastewater disposal, which is where you're taking a lot of toxic water that the industry has produced over time, and you don't know what to do with it, so you figure the best way is let's dump it in the ground somewhere and see what happens. And so you have more than 100 disposal wells in northern BC, many of which are actively triggering earthquakes at this point in time. So here's one in particular that gives you an idea of what's going on in these injection wells. So this is just one well outside of Fort Nelson that is now 46 years old and that has injected the equivalent of 17,000 Olympic swimming pools of waste, 41 billion liters, of water at this one site. There are thousands and thousands of these injection waste wells throughout North America. And so it should come as no surprise then that as the industry really tackled and promoted hydraulic fracturing as well as injection waste disposal at the same time, because one process makes a lot of waste and then that waste has to be disposed of, you begin to see the earthquake patterns in northern BC and Alberta dramatically change. So this is just a graph showing the magnitude 2.5 earthquakes and how they're on an upward trend. We're doing a good job of shaking things up there. In the United States, where there is so much more fracking and wastewater injection, phenomenal. A place like Oklahoma, which used to be one of the most seismically quiet places in North America, is now one of the most active. Thousands and thousands and thousands of earthquakes. So what do regulators say about this? Well, I found this slide. This was a presentation given by Dan Walker of the BC Oil and Gas Commission. The Oil and Gas Commission, by the way, told me I could not talk to Dan Walker about his presentation. I said, well, thank you very much. I don't understand why not. But here's Dan Walker saying, well, what are our concerns about all these earthquakes? I mean, there have been more than 1,000 since 2006 in BC alone. Right? More than 1,000. More than 20 of those have been felt at the surface. There have been weddings in northern BC where all of the guests were shaken and stirred, and not by what was going on at the altar. There's concern about surface effects, public safety, property damage. What if we can't control these things? Wellbore integrity, shaking other wells, rattling other plumbing, reservoir breakthrough, aquifer contamination, and then the government sort of says, well, don't worry, we'll set up a traffic light system. I mean, who sets up a traffic light system for earthquakes? I mean, where you need Monty Python to fully understand the absurdity at play here. Here's a company that's using a technology that is designed to make microquakes in the ground by fracturing rock that cannot control where all those fractures are going to go and what faults might be triggered and hit. And we're saying, okay, but what this industry obviously needs is a traffic light system. And so when you hit a magnitude 4 earthquake now, oh, that's a red light, you better shut down your operation. Even though that frac job still might cause an earthquake 2 or 3 months later, which has been well recorded in the scientific literature. And that's the system you have in northern BC. And that system is geared to the fact that, well, you just have First Nations in northern BC, and not a lot of white people, but there are white people up there. And so this is probably good enough for those people. Whereas in England, high density population, a little island with lots of people, their traffic light system, you trigger a 0.5 earthquake and you're shut down. So in Oklahoma, where there's been a lot of shaking and rattling, a lot of property damage, and an enormous number of lawsuits, and insurance companies are shaking their heads and beginning to wonder, should we or should we not offer earthquake insurance for hydraulic fracturing to ordinary Oklahomans? It used to have, in Oklahoma, you might have 2 or 3 earthquakes in the course of a year of a magnitude 3. Last year, Oklahoma had 1,000 magnitude 3 earthquakes. It is totally unreal, and almost all of it is due to fluid injection of wastewater. And so you have lawsuits, unreasonably, here's one lawsuit, unreasonably endangering the health and safety and welfare of persons and property. And that's after a 4.3 magnitude earthquake and a 4.2 magnitude earthquake just around Christmas time. And here's what some of the top scientists are saying. Whoa, major challenges exist in understanding the relationship between the volume of injection, the rate, the reservoir pressure underground, and they call this induced seismicity. It's really man-made earthquakes, as well as how to identify critically stressed faults. Again, this is a science experiment. We really don't know what's going to happen next. And here's the kicker for me. I think this is the most astounding bit of science out there. So when there's an earthquake in Chile of a magnitude 8 that kills 600 people, the seismic waves from that earthquake can travel to a waste injection well in Prague, Oklahoma, or a waste injection well in Snyder, Texas, or Trinidad, Colorado, and trigger earthquakes of magnitude 4 up to 5.6. And an earthquake in Japan can do the same, and an earthquake in Sumatra can do the same. So distant earthquakes are triggering significant earthquake activity around injection wells in North America because over time they have so destabilized the geology underground and changed the pressures and the fracture points. And the last point about earthquakes and why we need to think about them and why you have all this seismic activity, you're creating faults and fractures. That's what earthquakes do. They create cracks in the ground. They release a lot of energy. And man-made seismic vibrations do the same. And in the process, they can release all kinds of gases in the ground and let them flow to surface. Radon, methane, CO2. In Japan, one of the best indicators of an earthquake alert are rising radon levels. And this is exactly what we're seeing in heavily fracked areas. In New Mexico, San Juan Basin, this is now it's now called a methane anomaly. So you have an area over New Mexico and Colorado, the size of Connecticut, that has some of the highest concentrations of methane in North America. And last but not least, we come to groundwater. All right, so you're shaking all of this stuff underneath the ground. We know that when you have earthquakes in Alaska, severe earthquakes, magnitude 6, magnitude 7, magnitude 8, you can change groundwater flow, not just in Alberta, but you can also change it in Europe. And that has been well recorded again in the science. So here you've got industry fracking. And of course, the big problem is that you frack into water all the time. And here's from a very prominent industry textbook, because industry has always denied this is the case. A well can be fracked several times during its lifetime, and in some instances, however, hydraulic fracturing can harm a well by fracking into water. The hydraulically induced fractures extend vertically into a water reservoir that floods the well with water. Bingo. And we have a long period of evidence for this. So here's an Environmental Protection Agency report to Congress, 1987, and they're saying very simply, during the fracturing process, fractures can be produced, allowing migration of native brine, fracturing fluid, and hydrocarbons from the oil or gas well into a nearby water well. And why have not more of these cases be identified? In the same report, it mentions that that industry has sealed the public record with confidentiality agreements. So every time it harms groundwater and affects a water well, it will give that landowner some money, and in exchange for that money, the landowner will sign an agreement that says, I cannot talk about what happened here. So you remove all evidence from the public record. And increasingly, we see, this is a slide from a regulator presentation in Alberta. All right, we've got a problem. We've got more horizontal, multi-stage hydraulic fractured wells. we've got all these existing wellbores in the province that are leaking, and what's the problem here? Well, we have potential to impact assets. What they're saying is, geez, we have a potential to frack into their oil and gas wells and mess up their production, and we can also have a potential to go into groundwater, and in many different ways. And then when you talk to hydrogeologists about all this, and here in BC, they'll say, don't worry, we're monitoring groundwater. Well, actually, they have 7 monitoring wells, just 7 for more than 9,000 gas wells in the province. And John Cherry, one of the top hydrogeologists, he just laughs. He says, this is ridiculous. You need a multi-million-dollar network monitoring program that measures contamination over time at a multitude of levels and just doesn't take the occasional sample for 1 or 2 water wells. And he says, I view shale gas development as a big experiment for which we have minimal scientific basis for predicting the outcome for the impacts of stray gas on groundwater quality. And he's absolutely right. And this then brings us to the story of Jessica Ernst, because her story concerns a public resource, that of groundwater, being contaminated by industry activity that regulators wanted nothing to do with. Now, this a rather amazing portrait is by West Coast artist Mariana Gartner, who actually lives in Victoria, amazing artist. And this is called Skull Girl. And Jessica Ernst actually owns this painting, although she will have it up for sale soon. And she bought it because this painting spoke to her, and she thought, I'm that girl on the prairie. And you're thinking, okay, well, why would somebody pick something quite as grim and dark as this? It's actually the kind of artwork that if you were sexually abused as a child would speak to you. And that's how she felt as a 6- and 7-year-old child when she was repeatedly sexually abused. And this is an important part of her story because in order to understand why someone would take on the Alberta government in Canada, one of the largest shale gas developers on the continent, and the Alberta Energy Regulator, which is a bit like going into Texas and saying, you know what, I'm going to sue ExxonMobil, and I'm going to sue the Railroad Commission, the energy regulator, and I'm going to sue the state of Texas for contaminating my groundwater. That's exactly what Jessica Ernst has done here in terms of scale and difficulty. And this process has taken 8 years of her life. It has cost her $350,000 in the process, in counting. Her court case probably will not be settled for another 5 or 7 years, or let me put it this way, brought to conclusion. And so I wanted to talk, so why would she not settle? Why? Most people, in my experience as a journalist, when I come across ordinary people who are caught in these god-awful situations where industry has done something heinous and government has covered up and refused to do the right thing, and this all happens more often than we ever care to think, and then individuals or families are left floundering, wondering, what do we do? Where do we go from here? And in most of them will sell and move and be gone because they cannot take the stress. They cannot take the pain. But in Jess's case, she looks at it as much differently. She says, okay, the worst thing that could ever happen to a human being has happened to me as a child. So how can you make that? How can you beat that? You can't. So I've got you there. And not only that, I was in a position as a child where I could do nothing about that abuse. But as an adult, I'm in a position where I cannot remain silent. I cannot let a company and a regulator abuse a public resource which in groundwater travels over time, and contamination in groundwater travels over time. She cannot be part of that process. So this is where her case really blows up the whole fracking industry and has got it shaking. There have been thousands of cases in North America that have all been settled, and they've all been settled out of court, and the family and the industry has gone to them and said, here's your money, here's the confidentiality agreement, sign that agreement, and either get the hell out of here. And in some cases, these confidentiality agreements will say, your children and their children cannot talk about the contamination on your property forever. And you're thinking, okay, so where have you heard about this process being used before? There's a great film that just came out recently called Spotlight, and it's about the investigation of the Catholic Church and pedophile priests in Boston, and where a couple of very intrepid reporters at the Boston Globe began this process of investigation. And eventually they thought it was one or two priests, and in the end they found that there were actually 70 to 80 priests in the Boston area who had been abusing children. And how had the church covered that up? After a child had been abused, somebody from the bishop's office would appear at the family's doorstep and would offer them money. In return for the money, they would sign a confidentiality agreement that would make sure that no record of the abuse was ever public. The priest would then be assigned to another parish where the abuse would go on. And so that this using this kind of legal mechanism to cover up crimes is something that the oil and gas industry is an expert at doing. And but they never ever banked on the fact that they would come across someone like Jessica Ernst, who said, I will not settle. I will have my day in court where all of the evidence will be laid out on a table for all to see, and I will hold those people accountable for the abuse and the violation, not just of the groundwater, but of the communities that depend on that groundwater. So I wanted to end my talk here about this and with what I think is a rather extraordinary section from the book. And it concerns another landowner in the province who lives just north of Jessica Ernst, who lost her groundwater and had extensive property damage after some very shallow fracks went bad near her property. And she couldn't get anyone to pay attention to this. The regulators did exactly what they did to Jessica, which was they ignored her and they lied to her. And the reason the regulators have done that is because there have been so many examples of groundwater contamination in the province that if they owed up to it, it would just be like the Catholic Church. It would be a crisis in faith. And they don't want that. So Anne went to one of her sons who works in the oil and gas industry. And in fact, he might even be here tonight. His name is Brent, a very courageous young man. And Brent said, look, Mom, this is wrong. Let's go find a lawyer and let's see what we can do. So Brent goes to Calgary, and without knowing it, he gets an appointment with a lawyer by the name of Glenn Solomon. And Glenn Solomon just happens to be the lawyer that has been hired to defend the Alberta energy regulator against Jessica Ernst. And Brent brings with him his iPhone. He puts it on record, sticks it in his pocket, because he wants it played back to his mom and say, Mom, what do you think of this lawyer? Do you think this lawyer will do a good job or not? So Solomon does not know he is being recorded, which makes this conversation very precious. After 2 years of wrangling with the government, Brent O'Neill wanted to know what chances his mother might have if she sued the regulators for negligence. O'Neill tapped his conversation with Solomon on his iPhone because he planned to share it with his mother-in-law, with his mother. Take a step back, Solomon advised O'Neill in fatherly tones. I told you on the phone, I act for the Alberta Energy Regulator, which they've sued on these type of things. There's only one such case in Alberta that I'm aware of where they're using outside counsel, which is me at the moment, and that's an oil spill outside of Rosebud, Alberta, which has become more of a political grandstanding issue than a legal dispute. Over an oil spill, asked O'Neill for clarification. This was a fracking case, Solomon replied. Oh, said O'Neill. It was alleged contamination of a water well. Doesn't appear to be any personal injuries, and just groundwater contamination, interjected O'Neill. Groundwater contamination, confirmed Solomon. He continued, Encana is the oil company. They've said, we deny that we've done anything that will give you a lifetime of supply of portable water anyway, because we just don't care, and we don't want to fight with you. You know, it's Encana, and they have all the money in the world. And Alberta Environment and the Alberta Energy Regulator have been sued in that one as well. I can tell you it's a case that is 7 years old. I haven't yet filed a statement of defense because it's all tied up in preliminary applications. Because that's what happens when you start suing Alberta Environment and the Alberta Energy Regulator. Solomon went on. We keep on telling the plaintiff's lawyers, look, if you get rid of us, the dispute with the regulators, Encana's going to resolve this with you because they always do. That's what they do. Encana said, look, we're happy to pay for this without admitting or denying liability. This is a rounding error on our balance sheet. For God's sake, would you stop being a nuisance? But the PR and bad publicity that comes from it for everybody, is that even worth it? Asked O'Neill. Encana, the Alberta Energy Regulator, Alberta Environment, just don't care about that either, responded Solomon. They just don't care about bad publicity because what tends to happen is that the people who go yapping to the media are typically seen as nuisances. And this actually is nutcases. O'Neill then asked a direct question. On your experience with fracking and stuff, what's the success rate? O'Neill noted that Quicksilver Resources had a claim filed against them by Dale Zimmerman, a Wetaskiwin farmer, involving fracking and groundwater contamination. What's the Canadian climate for this kind of stuff? Is it worth a fight? I'm not aware of any cases that have gone to trial where fracking damage has been successfully proved, Solomon replied. But again, most of these cases resolve. Okay, we damaged your water well. We'll just set you up with portable water through a tank system forever because, we just spent $1 million drilling this well that we made $100 million on, and it's costing us an even extra $300,000. We're okay. Solomon elaborated on the industry's attitude. We don't need to litigate with you. We don't even need to know that it was our fault. We're just happy to pay you. And by the way, by doing that, you shut up. The regulators stay off our back. We get to do it again down the street. Thank you.
I don't see a switch on this. Is it on? Okay. That's why there's not a switch. Andrew, I remember publishing that story on the Tyee. I didn't sleep very well. You're telling me we have one of the most powerful lawyers in Alberta, secretly recorded, spilling all the beans about all the nasty things that he and his clients are up to, and you want us to publish this on the Tyee?
That's exactly what
right.
I wanted to do.
Why the hell do I write for you? You said. So we published it, and I waited, and eventually an email came my way. I don't know how you came by it, but I guess Brent received this email.
Yes, he did. Yeah.
And it was the lawyer saying, "Brent, why would you do that to me?" That's all he said. That was it. That was all we ever heard about it. But I just can't tell you what a privilege it is to be up here with you, my friend.
Well, thank you.
And I just think one of the greatest moments of my journalism career has been able to work with you as a colleague on all the amazing reporting.
Likewise, Dave.
I was writing a little piece about Andrew the other day, and I thought I'm just gonna throw in there the number of stories he's written for the Tyee. I bet it's a big number. I started working backwards from this year. I got to 2014. I was well over 100, 120 or 30. I got tired of counting. I never did figure out how many it was, but it must be 300, 400 stories you've written for the Tyee. And as you've seen this evening, Andrew is a master investigative reporter, which requires a lot of skills. The first skill, of course, is being able to have mastery over a very arcane subject. You have to become kind of a professor of whatever it is you're looking into, in this case, fracking. But professors are not always very interesting. I mean, I'm sorry, professors out there. I'm married to a professor. I'm sorry. But, you know, they're great on their subject, but they're not always great at a party. They know their facts.
My wife would agree with that.
They know their facts, and they have a hell of a PowerPoint. But the other skill that not just a great investigative reporter needs to have, but someone who engages the public imagination the way Andrew has done, is a command of narrative, of story, of what it means to be a human being. And Andrew has written book after book, article after article, that are just gripping, that are just compelling on the human level. This latest book is a perfect example of that. I mean, we met Jessica briefly at the end of your talk, but I think you did a great job of explaining why she's a very complex character and why she is a very compelling character. And Andrew's book, which I've read, really does her justice, I believe. And I recommend this book to you strongly, just as a fantastic read. You're going to learn a lot about fracking accidentally, but you're going to meet an amazing woman. You're also going to hear some amazing history. Andrew's book opens up with a shopping mall in LA in 1960-something blowing up and everybody running out of it. And you're wondering, how does this connect with a woman in Alberta? And you'll just have to get the book to find out. And I'm not the only one who thinks this is a great book. Publishers Weekly, which is the trade journal of the publishing industry, not a left-wing publication by any means, recently decided to evaluate Andrew's book. And this is what it does. It evaluates all the books that are published. They all get, most of them get mentioned one way or another. Publishers Weekly reserves a star, puts a star next to the very, very, very cream of the crop, the very, very best books. It's so amazing to have a starred review in Publishers Weekly. It's like being nominated for an Academy Award. And they gave Andrew's book a star. And they started off saying this book will infuriate its readers, but in a good way. I'd love to read you the whole blurb, but I'll just read you the last sentence. Nikiforuk peppers his rich narrative with a wealth of historical context about corruption in the industry he examines, making this book essential reading for every human whose soul is not clouded by methane or coated by oil. It's a fantastic book, and not only is each book by Andrew an incredible narrative in its own right, this is Andrew's fantastic contribution to Canada and the world, which is that nobody in this nation, which you notice how every election turns on oil wealth. What are we going to do with our oil wealth? Should we have, should we should we price carbon? Should we, subsidize the oil industry? It's the core of our economy. It's the core, or a lot of politicians want to make it the core of our national identity. And yet, name me another person other than Andrew Nikiforuk who has spent the last 25 years connecting all the dots into one grand counter-narrative to the narrative that we're fed all the time by people who have the money and the power to pervade their narrative of energy. We saw it up there. Happy Frackosaurus, I think we saw. I mean, he's the hero of that narrative. If Andrew Nikiforuk didn't exist and didn't spend the last 25 years of his life not getting rich, writing this narrative, we would be bereft. So I just have to say, thank you. Thank you for the gift that you've provided our culture. So I'm going to spend about 10, 15 minutes asking Andrew just a few quick questions, but then I want to invite questions from the audience. So begin formulating your questions now. The first thing I just want to ask is, I don't want to ask a bunch of questions about your presentation because it was so well done, but I want to ask you about some other energy-related questions that might be top of mind. So for example, when we listen to your account, I think people might say to themselves, it sounds bad. This fracking does not sound good. I'm willing to give you that, sir. However, there's no alternative. What is the alternative? How could BC possibly have an economy? How could BC possibly pay for the things that we consider to be necessary for an advanced industrialized society with a social safety net? How could he possibly do that if we don't shatter the ground beneath us and extract all these resources? What would you say to a person like that?
I would say that BC has so many extraordinary riches, many of which the province has squandered. I mean, when you consider what has happened to fisheries, what has happened to forests, do you now want to do the same thing with shale gas? When there are so many other things that the province can really take charge of and go forward with, whether it's being a leader in renewables and combining that with existing hydropower, whether it means at some point maybe some very small role for shale gas, but the gas is not to be given away, it's not to be squandered in foreign markets, but to be used strategically here for the benefit of British Columbians. There's just so much, part of the problem is that our politicians are wedded to this idea that business as usual is all about growth, and growth at any cost. And even if it means that you have to give away the farm to foreign corporations such as Petronas, which have virtually no transparency. This is a state-owned company that only reports to the Prime Minister of Malaysia, a notoriously corrupt individual who recently pocketed $600 million from a Saudi prince. Are those the kind of people you really want to do business with? And not only that, do you also want to give away public resources to have that business? Just so you can say, we've done something in this province. And what I find very interesting is that, almost all the economists in British Columbia were, and I said, BC's not doing so badly, and that's without LNG.
I really resonate to that because I don't really consider the debate over LNG to be a technical debate about an energy source and where the market's going. I actually read it on this level. Can British Columbians finally slough off this colonialized mindset that we have as a province? Can we stop imagining ourselves as completely in the thrall of and reliant upon decisions made by corrupt dictators in places like Malaysia? Why is our economic fate tied to those people? Surely we have some of the best universities. We don't have a very large population, but that could be to our advantage. I mean, it could mean that, for example, we graduate so many smart people from our universities. They make up a large percentage of our population. We are very attractive to smart people from around the world. Why is it that, our real estate is so massively expensive because we're such a desirable place to live, and yet we have to wait for our economic fate to be determined across the oceans? I mean, when are we going to decide to take charge of our own economy? That's kind of what I think the LNG debate is about, personally. Yeah. So that's all the grandstanding I'm going to do tonight. But I mean, that's just how I feel about it. Let me ask you this, though, since we're talking about foreign influences. The crash in the oil prices, which has largely been dictated, again, by decisions made by the Saudis and the fracking activity happening in the U.S. and the flooding of oil markets, again, completely out of our control as a nation. I don't really know how to react to this. Like, I never thought oil would be at, $28 a barrel. I always thought it was going to get more expensive all the time, and that fit into my narrative of that's why we need renewables. At a certain point, renewables will be affordable because oil will be just so expensive. So for me, when I hear oil so cheap, I say, well, it's slowed down things in Alberta, but it's also, isn't that a threat to the future of developing renewables? I mean, how do you read this new moment we're in with $28 a barrel oil?
Well, it's a very interesting story that really begins, we have to go back to $100 a barrel. So we had about 4 or 5 years when oil, was the most expensive it's ever been. And that had a real impact on the global economy. The global economy has basically evolved over the last 100 years on this myth that we will always have cheap energy to burn. And it is cheap energy that drives the economy. And it is, in many ways, the real currency, the global currency, that has created all of this growth. And when we started to hit the $100 a barrel, that all changed. And that should have been the signal that, hey, guys, business as usual is over. And now we got to really hit the hard stuff. We got to hit shale oil and shale gas, and we're digging bitumen out of the ground. And not only that, but oil and gas industry started to borrow enormous amounts of money to extract these really difficult, crappy, high-cost, high-risk resources. And the banks are only too happy to loan the money because we're in this very low-credit cycle, and nobody's making money on money these days, so why don't we give it to the oil and gas companies, and we've got $100 a barrel. And so as a result, you have an overproduction and a glut. And this is not just about Saudi Arabia.
Kind of an overshot response to the
Okay, and Alberta was very much a part of that. Yeah. I mean, we lowered our royalties. We encouraged this massive overproduction of bitumen. Up to, we went from 1 million barrels a day up to 3.5 million barrels a day. Mm-hmm. You had the fracking taking place in North Dakota and Texas and putting another 1.5 million barrels out there. You had other places in the world actually where conventional production is in decline. But when you add it all up, the glut is really only 1.5 million barrels in size. And that was enough, combined with the Saudis saying, you know what, we want to get rid of all this stuff we have because we can see the day when oil's not going to be worth very much either. So we're going to keep production because we we're the cheapest producers in the world as is.
And why would the Saudis think down the road oil wouldn't be worth much?
Well, they
What's
can see
competing against
with climate change, things changing. They can also see that global demand for oil has largely peaked. I mean, the United States is not burning more oil.
So
Europe is not burning more oil.
Sale.
Japan is
it's
not
a clearance sale is going on right now.
And China is not burning more oil. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So you have this temporary period where we have this overproduction, and now the prices drop, and you're going to see an enormous amount of panic in a lot of oil and gas companies because they're not making money at $30 a barrel. They're losing money. They're making maybe just barely enough to keep the creditors happy for a little bit longer. But everyone wants to keep the charade going. And we'll see how long it goes. But I think what we will see is enormous financial and political volatility as a result of these this huge price drop.
Yeah.
And it won't last. I mean, I think probably within a year's time, you'll see oil go back up again. I don't think you'll see it hit $100, but probably somewhere closer to 40, 50, or $60.
Mm-hmm. Okay. You know,
but it's going to affect all of us because the economic system was not designed for this kind of volatility. I mean, the global economic system started to shudder and quake at $100 a barrel, and it is still shuddering and quaking from that high cost energy. And nobody wants to address the fact that this is simply a story about diminishing returns. We are spending more capital, we are spending more energy on hydrocarbons, and we are getting less and less back. That is a recipe for contraction and for volatility.
Yeah, what makes me nervous is if I wanted to prepare a population for a lower growth economy where resources were more scarce and conservation was king, I probably wouldn't put the price of borrowing money at 2% and the price of oil at $30.
That's right. Yeah.
I think we're kind of having a mad party at the moment, and we're going to wake up with a hangover and not be particularly well prepared for what lies ahead.
No, and a lot of ordinary people are going to be hurt by it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The other image I get from Andrew's talk was an old Looney Tunes cartoon. Remember the one where the coyote's up on the tree branch and he's going to get away from his foe who's climbing the tree by sawing the branch off that he's sitting on. I kind of got that sense as we frack the ground beneath our feet out of desperation to get the last, bits of gas and oil, we're literally eroding the very ground that we stand on. We literally cannot count on the ground being stable beneath our feet, and I thought that was kind of a profound image. I want to open this up to the audience now. We're going to be very, I guess Robin said I was going to explain how this works. Okay, now let me explain this, okay? Here's how it works. You raise your hand, and then I go, and then if you think I'm pointing at you, stand up, speak very loudly. Oh, we have mics. I didn't know that. Oh, okay. Well, this is very good. So then I will point to you, and then someone with a mic, this wonderful person, will come and hand you a mic. Yes. Hi.
My name is Rob from Maple Ridge, just up the valley. I'm learning so much more than I knew there was even to think I could learn about the industry and the geophysics and the dangers. And I'm starting to get a background in my head that's reflecting back on my earlier concerns in this journey to understand fracking and the dangers of petroleum extraction. Always had me really concerned about the quality of the water that we want to drink. Like, what is happening to that? And then I suddenly thought, perhaps wrongly, correct me if I'm wrong, that we have $1 billion corporation who may be on our side, and that's Nestle's, because they also want our water, and they want good water.
Okay, so Andrew, what do you think of that? Will
Nestle save the day?
Bottled water industry prevent fracking from ruining our world?
Unfortunately not. But I mean, the points you raise, and what I find so extraordinary here, because if you go back and you read the scientific literature on fracking, and even on conventional oil wells, everyone talks about the hazards of gas migration, of gas straying from a wellbore and getting into groundwater and contaminating that groundwater, changing its chemistry, and then being in causing explosions, and on it goes. Plus, we're talking about the world's most potent greenhouse gas. We have known all about this, and so I think Jessica Ernst, one of the most key things that she really emphasizes here is the fact that you cannot adequately regulate this industry, because we know what the problems are, but has Alberta got a credible groundwater monitoring network that can measure contamination from oil and gas wells over time? No. Does BC have that? No. Does Saskatchewan have that? No. Does Colorado have that? No. Does Texas have that? Does Pennsylvania have that? No. Not one jurisdiction in North America has what any hydrogeologist would consider a competent program for groundwater monitoring. So can you then regulate an industry where the science says you must do this and you must do this, and both regulators and the industry refuse to do it?
And, hearkening back to the, I thought, rather ingenious traffic light system that the regulators came up with, Jessica Ernst got to a point where she could light a match at her kitchen sink and flames would come out of her spigot. Would that be a red light moment or a yellow light moment? It's like...
Actually, what Jessica, for her, it was one hell of a red light moment. Here's somebody who'd worked in industry for 30 years. She'd worked for Encana. She was an environmental consultant. She'd worked for companies like Chevron, the great Canadian oil sands company. She was part and parcel of the industry. And when she collected that water sample, because she knew something was wrong with her water, her dogs would not drink it. They'd turn their nose up at it. It was fizzing. Every time she got water from the tap, it was like pouring 7-Up or something. So someone, a heavy oil geologist who was a friend, said, there's something wrong with your water. It's either CO2 or methane. Check it out. So she found on the web how to do this. And so she poured it into a plastic jug and put a cap on it. And then 5 minutes later brought a flame to the top of the bottle. And the first time she did it, there was this whoosh of flame, melted the bottle completely in half. She's not one of these people that would light a flame like that in her kitchen, actually, because she knows that it's too hazardous. So, but she, and that for her was a moment of profound disbelief she realized then that the industry she worked for and that the regulators she thought were doing their job were not going to help her.
Because they said, well, that's why we're drilling around there. You've got that kind of water that's already got methane in it, and so we'd like to get some of that good stuff. We didn't have anything to do with that. It's a chicken or egg argument, and they tend to land on the same side every time. Who's got another question? How about right here in front? Yeah. Pays to sit in front.
I'm a neophyte to this area. However, I was up in Fort St. John visiting one of my sisters not that long back, and we, perhaps it was ill-advised, but we had a conversation about fracking. And she has a lot of children, and they work in the oil patch. But anyhow, as a result of that conversation, I quickly did a bit of Googling, and I found out that fracking appears to be banned in a number of American states, or at least portions of those states. So I'm just curious, it doesn't seem that Canada is taking such a proactive, strong stance. Rather,
so how does Canada stack up against other jurisdictions in terms of regulating and even discussing banning fracking?
There is a ban in New York State that was that took an awful lot of work and an awful lot of time, and that was successful because there really was a lot of oil and gas activity going on in New York at this point in time. Although there is a lot of the Marcellus Shale is there. And so a number of countries around the world where there has been little oil and gas activity have been very successful in putting up bans or moratoriums. France in particular. I mean, France looked at wine and cheese, and then they looked at fracking, and they made a very sensible decision. And it didn't take them very long to understand. If we want wine and cheese...
You don't want your glass of wine to catch on fire. That's just it.
And a lot of French cheeses can already do that anyway. And Bulgaria, a number of European countries, but areas that have had a long history of oil and gas activity, the industry has really stymied that grassroots movement to restrict or ban fracking. Even though there's been a very strong movement in Texas and very strong movement in Colorado as a result of just how disruptive the industry can become. I mean, it industrializes the landscape, it uses enormous amounts of water, it leaves a trail of pollution behind it, it destroys public roads. I mean, $1 billion worth of public roads has been destroyed in Texas alone by the fracking industry, more than any county in Texas.
By earthquakes or drilling?
By road traffic.
Uh-huh.
More than any county would ever earn back from this economic activity.
Wasn't there a moratorium in eastern Canada?
There are. Newfoundland has got a temporary ban. Quebec has got a temporary ban, except not on oil shale. Nova Scotia and New Brunswick have also got temporary bans, where there have been very active agricultural movements to protect water sources from this kind of industrial activity.
So far, there's been, since the topic of our conversation tonight is standing up to fracking, we've discussed suing regulators, a high-risk approach that's so far been taken on by only one person in all of Canada. And then there's kind of grassroots mobilization to pressure government to at least slow down or stop fracking until more is learned about it and some of this monitoring can be put in place. Are there any other ways to stand up to fracking that you have encountered or see?
Tony Ingraffia is probably one of the world's foremost experts on the science of fracking and how fractures behave in rocks. He's at Cornell University. And he thinks that if in jurisdictions that have not allowed oil and gas activity, you can keep it out. You can effectively keep it out with very well-organized movements from the beginning, just standing up to the science, which says, well, this is a highly disruptive technology that is highly unpredictable, and we can't really control it, and we're having difficulty regulating it everywhere. So in places that don't have that history of oil and gas activity, he thinks it's very prudent for them to limit this technology.
What are regulators and the government not doing in BC right now, short of stopping fracking completely? What is going on right now that should be challenged with a legitimate expectation of some success? What should we be asking, demanding of government and regulators?
Well, they're not monitoring groundwater over time. They do not have a proper groundwatering system, which they should have had set up more than 10 years ago. They don't have a gas migration program, so they're not studying and measuring atmospheric collections of radon, methane, or CO2 over areas that are being actively fracked to see if that fracking is actually acting like earthquake activity and releasing more gases from the ground in unpredictable ways, as has happened both in Oklahoma and in the San Juan Basin and in Australia. So those are two areas that I would start with. And then there's really no transparent program that is actively looking at the fact that there are 27,000 wells already in BC. We know that 10% of them are leaking chronically. We know that many of them are super methane emitters. Where's the transparent on the public record showing what the province is doing with those leaks already?
And measuring that would challenge the claims about it being a climate change.
And by the way, where are the white paper studies on the risks and benefits of shale gas and LNG, the long-term risks to the owners of the resource in BC? Where are those studies? Where are the cumulative impact studies? And where are the big picture studies on what will this level of seismic activity do over time to groundwater gas migration as well as geological formations?
Let's get somebody in the very back just to show that I'm very democratic about this whole thing. Do you want to take the mic all the way up there? Or somebody's doing that? Yeah? Oh, great. Just head up there because I'm going to point at somebody up there, yeah. There you go.
Hello there. Climate change is a rather hot topic. It turns out that a boast of the BC government is that natural gas is cleaner than coal. But it turns out also that, according to Dr. Ingrafia, that equation rather depends on the rate of methane leakage as a fugitive gas from frack wells and pipelines and compressor stations. I think you've answered the question already, but I would like to maybe tease it out in more detail. What is the BC government doing to monitor that? And knowing that several of the US states have been monitoring it in the air over these areas and have discovered that the rate of emissions are twice what the industry is reporting.
Not much. And it's really where this whole thing all falls apart. In some areas of the United States, leakage rates from shale gas producing fields are around 9%. So, and when you have a leakage rate of 9%, then those shale gas producing projects are 3 times dirtier than any coal mining project. So when you need a leaking rate of 3% or less if you want to dare make the claim that shale gas might be a bit cleaner than coal. But all of the science I've seen to date suggests that when you take into account the leakage rates, which are much greater at fracked wells because of all the rattling and shaking going on, and when you take a look at what methane is actually leaking from the fields themselves, that shale gas is a net contributor to climate change. And I think we have to, I mean, I'm really appalled at how the province uses this term clean energy, that somehow, okay, this industry is using enormous amounts of water, it is industrializing Treaty 8 lands, killing off caribou, and that somehow this makes it clean. And you know, and I would encourage all of you to, whenever you hear the term clean energy, really to shake your head and realize that you're having a true Orwellian moment, and where somebody is using language improperly. And this really applies to Greens as well, because even when Greens talk about wind energy and solar energy, and you know, and they often will speak glowingly of these renewables. These renewables aren't clean. They all have challenges as well. They all require an enormous investment of fossil fuels to create their infrastructure, and they all have impacts on the land. And I've seen wind projects and I've seen solar projects that in terms of the industrial scale and in terms of their impacts on the land and on people are just as dirty as any oil and gas development.
And we
need to keep that in consideration. You know.
Thanks for a great question and a great answer. We also don't. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think that in the official provincial measurement of Seth Klein would know this for sure. The way the province measures its greenhouse gas emissions, it doesn't take into account at all the burning of this gas once it's been shipped away, right? So we talk about what's emitted while we produce it as if it's never going to be burned and then go into the atmosphere. Is that right? That's someone else's problem, yeah. So as long as you're flinging your garbage over your neighbor's fence, then it's not yours anymore, yeah.
The other issue about the methane, it's just as important, is that a lot of the shale gas in northern BC has a very high content of CO2. So most conventional gas would have a content of CO2, some CO2 in it, of around 3 or 4%. There are shale deposits in northern BC that have contents of CO2, of carbon dioxide, as high as 12 or 14%. So you cannot exploit that resource without venting. That CO2 is currently being vented into the atmosphere. So you potentially have shale gas deposits in northern BC that make shale gas much dirtier and more climate changing kind of activity than even bitumen extractors in northern Alberta.
So I want to give someone else a chance to ask a question, but as long as we're talking about clean energy, let me very quickly ask for just a very short answer from you, Andrew. Site C Dam. That's clean energy, right? Is it or is it not, in your opinion, having looked at this industry within BC, would it be necessary to serve BC's power needs if we weren't doing LNG? Or is the reason that we're damming the Peace River simply to power up the LNG industry, which, as you've just demonstrated, is as dirty as coal by some measures?
Well, I think the real truth is even more appalling. The only reason the government is pushing the Site C Dam is so that they can actually say we have a mega project on the books that's employing people. There is no argument for this dam that makes any sense. The LNG industry will say, you know what, we'll burn our own natural gas, and that's how we'll power our stuff, and that's probably a cheaper, more effective way for us to do it. And even if 2 or 3 projects get off the ground, they won't require any of this Site C stuff for a while. Which is not to say, though, that there aren't plans to build transmission lines to help the fracking industry use less gas and more electricity, subsidized by British Columbians. So this is a $9 billion project that will raise everyone's electrical rate in the province, because you'll have to pay for this within 10 to 15 years, for which there is no real demonstrable energy need, which is why the province has refused to take this project before the Public Utilities Commission for a needs assessment. And when governments do that, they are pulling one right over your eyes, and they are robbing you.
Right there. Okay.
That she's going to stand up against Kinder Morgan. It's precisely to deflect attention away from her pet project of LNG, her clean energy.
Absolutely.
Okay. So if people weren't able to hear that because we didn't have the mic there, the question was, do you think that Christy Clark is sort of playing one energy hot button headline off against the other, and by standing up to Kinder Morgan, demanding that Kinder Morgan meet her requirements, she's trying to deflect attention from the downsides of LNG? And then Andrew's response to that was, yeah. All right, so yes, over here. Trying to give the microphone people a good workout. There we go, yeah.
Thank you. Just really quickly, Rich Colman was alluding yesterday to having some sort of a secret up his sleeve as far as we haven't even had a chance to tell the feds yet what we're doing up in the fracking fields, which is really making things a lot greener and cleaner. Do you have any idea about what he might be alluding to?
Not a clue.
Okay. And then if I could just add one other quick question. Reading your book and seeing and learning about what's going on with the groundwater in Alberta was devastating for me, coming from Alberta originally. Do you have similar stories coming out of the northeast of BC? I have not heard any myself. Are you aware of any?
I've certainly heard a lot of stories from landowners up there about increasing problems with groundwater, with fracking actually changing groundwater levels, changing the course and direction of groundwater. First Nations also have a lot of very similar concerns. Again, the problem is that no monitoring is going on, and very little baseline data was ever collected. So, what exactly was there before the frackers came around and actually changed everything. So that's part of the problem. But there have been documented cases of waste pits leaking and contaminating groundwater, for sure, in northern BC.
We just had a 9-year experiment with a government that basically felt, why measure this stuff, because then you just draw criticism and are asked to possibly alter your claims. It might be worth reminding the Premier of British Columbia that government is no longer in power because people were tired of that approach to things. It sounds like the same basic strategy is going on in the fracking fields of BC. If we're not measuring it, then it can't be challenged. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Any problems with TPP and international investment in oil and gas? And thank you so much for trying to get there. He's just very fast. He was up. He was just talking. I mean, you did your best. Okay.
I see a lot of problems with these international trade agreements. Largely, that all boil down to sovereignty. That all of these trade agreements are eroding national sovereignty and giving more and more power to corporations. And that's a dangerous thing, particularly when you have a government that is hell-bent on exporting shale gas to Asia at bargain basement rates. And that has lowered regulations, lowered tax rates to do so. And lock those in for 25 years. And those trade agreements then give corporations the right to say that if another government comes along, a government that is a little more sober-minded, says, wow, this was a mistake. These agreements are not going to serve the people of British Columbia very well, then there's no avenue for them to actually make those democratic changes. So that I see that as a really dangerous. And I think what you're seeing, why are all these trade agreements coming around all at once? It's another indication that business as usual is over, the global economy is stagnating, that financial institutions have to come up with some new mechanism to churn more dollars to the 1% is eventually what happens, and mechanisms to make that happen, because we really are experiencing a period of massive stagnation that is reflecting in many ways the low quality of energy we are getting out of the ground these days.
So I want to finish this by 9, and then Andrew's going to sign books. So I think we have time for maybe one more question, then we'll see if you could be fast about that. How about you in the white sweater there? Yeah. Is that white? No?
Yeah.
Is it not white? Sorry.
Thank you. You've used the word several times, and I think it's important, is narrative. And Andrew has a particular narrative that's obviously compelled all of us to be here. And Andrew's raised a really important question: where are the studies? Where's the measurement? Where's the monitoring? And that is exactly it, and you've alluded to it yourself. What I don't understand is we've just gone through a federal election that was preceded by a good year or 18 months of people across the country screaming about muzzled scientists. And yet we must be allowing that to happen in British Columbia. Because where is the measurement? Where are the studies? What is our understanding about our groundwater and the use of water and the impact of water? What is the impact of permanently removing all of this water, putting it somewhere which is going to cause more damage because it's too toxic for us? So I'm wondering what's going to happen to BC that's going to take Andrew's narrative and make it more mainstream. I appreciate that the Tyee is doing everything possible. But I feel like we're too comfortable. On the one hand, we have a premier who brings in a carbon tax, and on the other hand, we fuel our recovery from the recessions with oil and gas revenues and with increased auto and truck sales. Like, we are not, as a group of people who are being willing to be governed, we don't seem to be asking ourselves the hard questions about how do we contribute to our own discomfort in order to actually see the change we say that we want to have. So and that's what disturbs me.
Okay, so that's great to share what disturbs you. And I also heard a question in there, if I can recap. So 2 parts. The first question is pretty straightforward. Is it that scientists just aren't being asked to find out anything, or are they finding out things and being muzzled? That was the first question. And then the second thing is, Andrew, these facts are available to you. You had to work hard to get them, but you did get them. You wrote a brilliant book. The Tyee puts stuff up on the intertubes, and people can find them. Why is it so hard for this narrative to take hold and mobilize a political counter-movement? So those are the 2 questions.
Okay. The government has not invested in the science that hydraulic fracturing really requires, and has ignored the issue of groundwater and gas migration altogether. They have invested a limited amount of science to date on the whole unbelievable and scary phenomenon of earthquakes. And yet when I look at the presentations by these scientists, some of them are federal, some of them are provincial, some of them are university-based, they sort of always end their presentations by saying, well, you know, these earthquakes are a little bit unprecedented. They don't behave like natural earthquakes because they're quite shallow. And the shaking and felt activity on the surface will likely be more dramatic and more powerful than the magnitudes of natural-made earthquakes. And we seem to see a real escalation in scale here. Yet at the same time, we're hoping we can find a sustainable way to frack the earth. Okay. So some science is being done, most of it's being ignored, and the really important monitoring has not been entertained at all. Partly because the Oil and Gas Commission in this province is 100% funded by industry and was set up by industry lobbyists, and it is not there to really deal with uncomfortable realities and facts. So the second thing, okay, really about British Columbians, why have British Columbians not really caught on to some of the really serious economic and political issues that are being raised here? And I think it's in many of the same sort of ways that these issues were also being avoided in Alberta. All right, so in Alberta, we never debated the money, we never debated about saving, we never debated about a rainy day, we never debated about the volatility of the resource, we never debated about putting all of our eggs in one basket, and in fact, we vilified those people that said, you know, we need a conversation about this. And part of this is very Canadian. We're a mining people, and we don't want to have that conversation, because if we have that conversation, we have to question ourselves as a mining people. And I think that's one of the reasons we're uncomfortable with this issue in British Columbia, because British Columbia is very much a mining jurisdiction. All right, so it means really asking some hard questions about our behavior and our future as a people and how we want to relate to the land. That's one of the reasons we're avoiding it. Another reason is that it's much easier to steal billions from a people than it is millions. And, you know, it's one of the miracles of the internet and the fact that we can now be so distracted as a people all of the time that governments and corporations can and do get away with extraordinary things. But at the same time, too, I would say that Canadians, I mean, it took them a long time to really understand what Stephen Harper was trying to do to the country. And I would say it's taken British Columbians even longer point to realize that the same crew that was running the federal government is basically running BC here, with the same goals and the same intent.
I will just, Andrew and I always have a joke, because whenever I'm editing him and we start discussing his piece and then we kind of spin out and start discussing the state of the world, we always end up with two definite conclusions. One, we should just kill ourselves now. And second, I've never laughed so hard. Because Andrew has this amazing ability to kind of look at the hard truths, but always remain funny and if not optimistic, at least resolute to forge on. I would just go back to your point where we're reminding people to ask these tough questions about our economic identity would question who we are. I get that. I think that the global economy now is so volatile that it feels that what's going on south of the border is so bizarre politically that we're starting to feel like we are a unique people, and we really shouldn't be so reliant on the decisions and strange behaviors of others outside our borders, and that we can only really benefit from asking these tough questions and forging some kind of economy that's sustainable and under our own control much more going forward. And so that's, you know, I say bring it on. Let's have this LNG discussion, but let's ask the bigger questions too. Thank you tonight, Andrew, for this. This was tremendous. Thank you so much. It went a little longer than we thought it would, but that's just because it was so damn interesting. And thank you to Am Johal and SFU Woodwards. Thank you, Robin Smith and Jeanette Ageson, for making this happen. Michelle Hoare as well. And we'll see you upstairs, and Andrew will be there to sign books. Thank you very much, everybody.
And I'd like to thank David Beers, the great David Beers. Thank you, David.